Thank you for that, and thank you, John. As someone who grew up in Australia and lived there for 30 years, I'm very keen to keep an eye on my skin, so I will be downloading the app as well when I get home. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. As Imogen was saying, I'm from NHS England, and I work on the New Cancer Drugs Fund. So a lot of my role is around working with the National Institute for Clinical Excellence and with pharmaceutical companies to work out how we provide access to cancer drugs in the NHS. And it's also a lot about working with Public Health England to make sure we can get the evidence to evaluate the drugs that are entering the Cancer Drugs Fund. So what I'm going to talk about is decision-making primarily around chemotherapy cancer drugs. But of course, there are a lot of other treatments the NHS provides, and arguably other treatments are as effective, if not more effective, than cancer drugs. So this is in a wider context, and I understand that the perspective that I'm coming at through this is quite narrow, so there's a lot more information that NHS England can provide other than this. So Imogen was explaining to me that you guys would like a bit more information on how decisions are made around funding for treatments at NHS England. So I just wanted to start by explaining some of the routes that are available for patient access to treatments. There are a number of ways that pharmaceutical companies can actually get earlier access, provide patients with earlier access to treatments before NICE or NHS England make them available. And there are two early access arrangements. One is a new scheme that's run by the National Institute for Health Research, NIHR, and they enable companies to get access or provide patients with access through the Early Access to Medicine scheme. The great thing about that scheme is that we collect data on patients who are being provided those drugs. We feed that into the evaluation, patients get access to it, and we can work out how effective these drugs are from the earliest possible point. And of course, companies also are willing to provide patients with access to drugs on a compassionate basis, free of charge, through NHS treatment as well. So we have arrangements for that to happen as well. The majority of what I'll be talking about will come under the NICE technology appraisal processes, where we have either decisions for routine commissioning, so that's where the NHS pays out of their baseline budget, or the Cancer Drugs Fund, which is money that the Department of Health gives to NHS England to pay for promising new cancer drugs. We also have a process around individual funding requests. I mention it here advisedly. It's really for cases where there is clinical exceptionality, really unique cases where patient's individual cancer, for whatever reason, does require an individual approach to considering how we offer treatment to that patient. It is available though, and we do receive thousands of applications, although, as I understand, the proportion that are approved through that route is often quite low, but it enables NHS England clinicians to have a conversation with treating clinicians about the best options for each patient. And then the final option as well is the NHS England clinical prioritisation process. This is where if none of these other routes are available for funding, NHS England will actually step in. Clinicians tend to sponsor these policies, and they go on to either being funded through NHS England or sometimes being referred back to NICE, because we think NICE should have considered these as part of their decision making. So as I said, most of my presentation will be around how we implement NICE technology appraisals. That's just because that's my area of expertise, but happy to answer questions either on the panel or later on during the lunch break around these other ones as well. So you may know the Cancer Drugs Fund was reformed in 2016. In July of that year, we started operating this new model. And there are a number of key things that are different around the new fund, which are all designed to put a bit more process and structure around the cancer fund and to make it a lot more sustainable and predictable, so that patients know what topics are likely to be funded and for how long. So the new process has meant that NICE has now got an additional option when they're considering a cancer topic. So previously they could either recommend that something not be routinely commissioned or be routinely commissioned, but now for cancer drugs, all cancer drugs, there's now this third option to refer it to the CDF for a limited period, during which time we'll evaluate the effectiveness of that using data from clinical trials and from Public Health England, so the SACT Systemic Anti-Cancer Therapies database, will provide us the data to do that. So we've got this new process. In terms of how decisions are made at this point, NICE will tend to routinely commission anything that produces a cost-effective outcome, and they've got various thresholds for that, which, again, I'm happy to explain in a break, but they're probably just too detailed for a 20-minute presentation and involve a lot of economic theory, which, again, I'm very happy to explain offline. One thing that I'm really proud of with the Cancer Drugs Fund is that we're now offering treatment an awful lot earlier than before. So excuse me, everyone who's over there. The way this system works, so along the top here, we have the various steps in NICE's process at a very high level. Previously, under the old CDF, and for all other treatments within the NHS, we would tend to fund here at the very end of the NICE process. What the green bars show with the Cancer Drugs Fund is that we're actually starting to fund cancer topics, whether they be recommended for the Cancer Drugs Fund or whether they be recommended for routine commissioning, up to 8 months earlier. So if NICE issue draft guidelines saying that a drug looks clinically and cost-effective in cancer, we start treating from that point. So there's a great opportunity here for patients who do have diagnoses for cancer, who do need access to these drugs, to receive them so much earlier and at a point that could actually make a real difference for those patients. And you've heard me talk a couple of times about data, but the other really key part of the new Cancer Drugs Fund is that we're not letting any drugs in. We're letting drugs in that NICE think there is, that are promising, but there's still some uncertainty in the evidence. So the clinical trials haven't yet matured, or the clinical trials that do exist don't have the data to show how they compare to other drugs that are also being offered for those for those cancers as well. So what we're able to do here is work with companies and the ongoing clinical studies that they've got to ensure that we feed this data in as soon as we get it, but also Public Health England's SACT database is also proving a real source of useful validation and confirmation of what's coming out of the clinical trials. So we know that clinical trials often report optimistic data, but SACT is able to give us a real-world assessment of what patients' outcomes actually are, rather than us having to guess what we think they really would be. And then the new Managed Access Fund has been set up so that we have in place a number of things before a drug can enter the Cancer Drugs Fund. And again, this is all designed at making the fund manageable. So we make sure that we've got an agreement with the company about how we're going to collect data. We agree what questions we're going to answer. We agree how the clinical trial is going to feed into that, what data is going to come from SACT, how often we're going to report it, and for how long we think we'll need to follow this drug. So at the moment, we're having drugs enter for as little as 9 months because the clinical trial data is so mature that we really are just giving earlier access to patients where we can. And other drugs are actually entering for 3 to 4 years because we need that long to try and evaluate them. But during that entire period, patients will get access. We then, of course, need to agree the price of the drug, which is what the commercial access agreement is about. And to ensure that the fund is sustainable, companies are having to sign up to what we've called an expenditure control mechanism. And I'll explain that in just a second. And together, these 3 elements add up to what are now called managed access agreements for cancer drugs. So it's a new way that we're funding drugs within NHS England. A lot of lessons learned from this process and a lot of interest in how we can adapt this and apply it to other disease areas. So it's not just cancer that's getting slightly special treatment. And then the final point was to make the Cancer Drugs Fund financially sustainable. We want to make sure that patients are able to access these drugs. Previously, we saw a lot of overspending. So the dark blue bars here on the left are the budget for the fund, and the light blue are the actual spend. And as you could see, in 2014, 15, and 16, we were well overspent on the Cancer Drugs Fund. And then last year, we managed to spend just shy of the budget. So we were able to make sure we utilised as much of that as we possibly could. What this means is that the fund is open, remains open, so that patients can continue accessing drugs. that we can continue to put new drugs into the fund, and that we can manage this in the round through the expenditure control mechanism, which means that we work collaboratively with companies that if the fund does overspend, they all agree to pay back a portion of the income that they've received so that the fund can stay open. And what I would really have loved to have done is put the last year of data on there because it's only a few weeks away from being finalized. But we know that in the final year here, in the third quarter, I think we'd spent £141 million, which is less than we might have expected. But in a second, I'm going to explain why we've spent less in the Cancer Drugs Fund, because it's actually a good news story that we spent less in Cancer Drugs Fund. So where is it at the moment? Since the new fund started operating, 22,500 roughly patients have received treatment through this fund. Just over 5,000 have been funded through the new drugs that have entered for a managed access period. So they're the drugs that we're collecting data on. They're the ones that we're evaluating to see how clinically effective they are. And then when I was showing you in NICE's process, the blue bars versus the green bars giving it earlier access, over 6,000 patients have benefited from that earlier access period. And we've funded 63 drugs in 112 different cancers. So some big numbers there. And it explains, when I have seen those numbers, why I feel busy sometimes that we've put that many drugs through in just 2 years. So part of the reason we're not spending as much as we thought we would is that the decisions that NICE are making have changed. So NICE's decisions to, or the proportion of decisions that NICE make to recommend a treatment has remained relatively stable at about 2/3. But the number that NICE are now saying no to has fallen. It's fallen from about 1/3 to 15%. And the difference in here are indications that are being recommended for the Cancer Drugs Fund. So the CDF effectively is enabling NICE to say yes to more drugs. So we're now getting yeses to approximately 80% rather than 62, 63%, which it was previously. And this is just, again, a bit more information on the process for how we get through the decision making. So again, apologies to people on the right of the room. When we do collect the data, at the end of the data collection period, there's a process of working out with NICE whether something is then going to be routinely commissioned down here, and that will be based on the evidence, or whether the decision is to not routinely commission. So far, of the 17 drugs that have entered the fund, we've had 2 that have reached the point where NICE have had to reappraise these indications. And the really good news for both of these is that they've both been recommended for routine commissioning. So brentuximab vedotin was recommended back in, I think it was March, and has just in the past month or so entered routine commissioning, and pembrolizumab for non-small cell lung cancer is also about to enter routine commissioning. What is really good about these is that they're demonstrating how this data collection period and the review by NICE is actually working to confirm that drugs that are entering the Cancer Drugs Fund should be funded. An additional benefit for NHS England is that one of these drugs we were able to identify that the clinical data was a little bit optimistic, and we were able to renegotiate the price with the company based on that as well. So it's helping us drive extra value at NHS England as well, while keeping these drugs available to patients. And these, just breaking down some of the numbers that I was providing earlier, just demonstrate some of the flows in terms of patients getting access to cancer drugs. While the new while the new fund came into existence last year, we're continuing to fund, which is the dark green line here. We're continuing to fund patients who receive treatments under the old fund until they're reappraised by NICE. And as of about 3 weeks ago, we're down to 1 transition topic remaining from the old fund, which we're still funding. The red line shows how we're funding patients to receive treatment earlier in the interim funding period. And the darker blue line is that rises up on the right-hand side is the managed access agreement. So as more topics enter the CDF, that line will continue to rise, and we expect that that will start to reach a steady state in maybe 12 months or so. So we expect to see the number of managed access, or the patients accessing CDF treatments to continue to rise like that. And then because I come from a commissioning background, the spend is important. So the interim funding line very much follows the patients that we saw previously, as does the transition. We're seeing that trend down, and then managed access agreements are coming up. So the reason the CDF is underspending at the moment, although it's not technically underspending because we're spending that money on other cancer topics, is because this green line is coming down and the blue line hasn't yet reached the peak that we think it will in 12 months' time. So while the CDF hasn't spent its full budget in the last 12 months, we think that's temporary, and we're already looking forward to the new financial year, and seeing that that isn't going to be a problem that we're going to have next year, we think. So what comes next in terms of the CDF? We're in the process of doing an operational review. We wanted to stop once we'd had a few topics enter and leave the CDF to see how this is working, and we're hoping to report that later this year. But what I'm really keen to do is make sure that we come out to patient groups and to share what we think the findings of this review are, and to see what you guys think as well. So be very keen to pick up on how we do some of that. We're sharing the lessons learned back at NHS England. This is a really interesting way to fund new innovative treatments that aren't yet proven. I think we're all very familiar with in the NHS being such an evidence-based organisation that in the absence of evidence, we often make no decisions, whereas this fund is enabling us to acknowledge that the evidence is missing and go and find it. So it's enabling us to make decisions to give patients access in a controlled way, and then evaluating whether or not these treatments work. Another area that we need to develop a bit more work around is how we set treatment criteria for these drugs. So at the moment, we're working with NICE to see how we can do that in a more consultative way as part of their processes potentially. And the reason treatment criteria is so important is because NHS England translates NICE guidance into a set of questions that clinicians can then use to check whether or not a patient is eligible. The alternative to that is the patient reading a 30 or 40-page document from NICE and trying to interpret whether the patient sat in front of them is eligible to receive this treatment. So this is NHS England's way of trying to make the job of the clinician a bit easier. But what we're missing at the moment is input from external stakeholders to make sure that we're getting these criteria right. So that's another area that we're looking to improve. And if I haven't said enough, I think what we're not doing enough at NHS England is engaging with companies, patient groups and charities around the CDF, because I think we've got some good news stories in here, and we're not talking about them enough. But we also need to come and verify whether what we think is good news for patients. Are you guys seeing the benefits that we think exist? And working with third sector charities, which are often quite good at helping lobby our organisation to help us make sure that we're facing in the right direction and making the right changes that we need to. So that's all I had to say there, but obviously very happy to answer questions at the end, and very happy for you to contact me on my email address afterwards as well. Thank you.